Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a federal holiday that this country has marked since 1986. It sadly took nearly 2 decades after his death for Congress to agree to it, and even then, plenty of prominent Republicans at the time, like the late Senator John McCain and the current GOP Senator Chuck Grassley, voted against it. Still, today, the Republican Party, like Americans as a whole, claims to love MLK and what he stands for, at least who they think he is and what they think he stands for. For most Republicans, Dr. King is just a guy who said to forget about skin color. They basically know just one quote of his out of context, and they repeat it ad nauseum.
We embrace the noble vision of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and believe that people should not be judged based on the color of their skin, but the content of their character.
You think about what MLK stood for. He said he didn't want people judged on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character.
Where he said most critically, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
We do not seek to judge people by the color of their skin, but rather the content of their character.
But it isn't just Republicans who don't quite get Dr. King, who want to, for want of a better word, whitewash MLK. It's the American public, American society as a whole. This country has spent decades engaging in what Dr. Cornel West calls the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King, the sanitizing and domesticating of Dr. King, to quote Dr. West. Over Christmas, I had family visiting me from California, so I took them to the MLK Memorial in D.C., a stunningly beautiful and poignant tribute to the late civil rights leader. We took photos by the legendary MLK quotes up on the walls there. You know the ones. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. But you know what was missing at that memorial? The quotes from the late Dr. King that show what a radical he was. For example, what he said in his Beyond Vietnam speech at the Riverside Church in New York in April 1967, a year before his death, and I quote, "I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." That quote, weirdly, didn't make it onto any of the walls at his memorial. By the way, can you imagine if AOC or Ilhan Omar said that today, that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today was the American government? It wouldn't just be Republicans losing their minds, it'd be their fellow Democrats, it'd be the liberal media too, and many ordinary patriotic Americans. But Dr. King said it. Because Dr. King wasn't just passionately anti-racism, he was proudly anti-war, he was ferociously anti-poverty. For Dr. King, as he pointed out in that Riverside speech, what needed to be conquered were the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. Today, we remember Dr. King's struggle against racism. We try, often in his name, to continue his struggle against racism. The George Floyd protests, the attempts to restrain our trigger-happy police departments and tackle the racial inequality baked into America from the campus to the C-suite to Congress. But how about the struggle against militarism? With our bloated Pentagon defense budget and our endless wars abroad, which have left so many people dead? How about the struggle against extreme materialism that has left millions in poverty and destitution while allowing the creation of billionaires who exploit workers and dodge taxes? You know, the New York Times, the liberal New York Times, back then, 3 days after the Riverside speech and Dr. King's talk of the giant triplets and American violence, the Times slammed him in an editorial headlined, "Dr. King's Error." They accused him of wrongly fusing 2 public problems, racism and war, that are distinct and separate. But Dr. King didn't back down. Racism, war, poverty, they were all interconnected for him. Racial justice had to go hand in hand with economic justice. What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger, he famously declared. And remember, in March 1968, MLK was assassinated in Memphis, and he was in Memphis to support sanitation workers who were on strike for better pay and conditions. In fact, in 1967, less than a year before his death, Dr. King spoke with NBC News at his Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, about what the pastor called the new phase of the struggle for genuine equality, his Poor People's Campaign.
And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
And here's something else that they don't tell you about Dr. King. He wasn't a capitalist. He was a socialist. Huh? Yeah. The S word that gives everyone from Donald Trump to Nancy Pelosi the jitters. And yet Martin Luther King Jr. was a socialist. As a 23-year-old writing to his then-girlfriend, Coretta, in 1952, MLK said, "I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic, and that capitalism has outlived its usefulness." Over a decade later, just a couple of years before he died, Dr. King said that something is wrong with capitalism and that there must be a better distribution of wealth. Maybe, he said, America must move toward a democratic socialism. You'll be surprised to hear that that quote isn't on the wall at his D.C. memorial either, and isn't cited by Republican or Democratic politicians today. So, on this MLK Day, let's be honest with ourselves and with his legacy. Let's remember Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the man, as the proud radical and socialist he actually was, not as the man we conveniently want him or imagine him to be.